Welcome to talk today on four things we may not have thought about yet for music and hearing aids. I'm going to begin with some of the things we do know and go beyond that to some of the things that may show up or may not show up depending on many factors in the future. My name is Marshall Chasin. I'm an audiologist at the Musicians Clinics of Canada. And as the name suggests, I do a lot of work with musicians, both hard of hearing musicians, as well as people that just like to listen to music, many of whom have normal hearing. Some people do have hearing difficulty. Conflict of interest declaration, I should point out, is that I do have a book called Music and Hearing Aids. It's not really a conflict of interest. I think it's an area of interest declaration. It's from Plural Publishing. It's actually quite a good book. Well, I wrote it, but obviously it's quite a good book. But it's written from a clinical perspective, so it has all the research and all the references, but also it has 15 to 18, I can't quite recall, embedded audio files, so that you'll be able to click on it and actually listen to the phenomena that I will be talking about. This is a picture, has nothing to do with this talk. It's from 1880s. This was from a gentleman by the name of Brown, was his last name. He gave a talk in the 1880s about how he thought the ear evolved sound into various musical notes, in other words, how we hear, long before we understood the function of the cochlea and the basilar membrane function. Von Beckersheim was in the audience, apparently, and he approved of it. It's completely wrong, but it's very romantic. I've checked it out, and you can rub certain parts of your ear, and it's supposed to make certain sounds. The different parts of the pin have certain resonances. It's not the case, but it's an interesting story nevertheless. 8 things we do know about music and hearing aids. First, we have to disable the advanced features. I'll be talking a little bit about that later. But of course, we want to just disconnect our feedback management system. Even today, we have hearing aid technology where the feedback manager cannot discern the difference between feedback and a higher frequency harmonic. And I have had cases where flutes have been turned off by the feedback manager confusing the harmonics of the flute for a feedback squeal. Some manufacturers have restricted their feedback manager to the higher frequencies. That has improved things somewhat, but still it's quite problematic. So if you can completely disable the feedback manager. The same thing, which I'll talk about in a second, about disable the noise management as another advanced features. We'll be talking about similar frequency responses. We do know that there's a similar frequency response in a hearing aid for a music program as for a speech in quiet program. This, like the next one, similar compression characteristics for a music program versus a speech in quiet program are also the case because both of these things, the frequency response and the compression features, are more cochlear damage issues rather than the nature of the input stimulus per se. And so that's why they would be very similar. If you've, let's say, implemented or want to implement a broader frequency response for a music program, then you should go back and ensure that your speech and quiet program also has that similar program. And I'll be talking a little bit about that later. Consider a more linear setting for streamed music. We know that from the work done in Colorado by Krogan, Earhart, and Cates, where they argued quite successfully and correctly, I think, that MP3s are already compression limited once, and then maybe the smartphone that they're using also has a compressor on it that cannot be disabled. So what is streamed out of your smartphone may be actually a highly compressed signal, and you don't want your hearing aid program to compress it a third or fourth or fifth time down the line. It can actually make it very poor. It's amazing how much compression we can get away with before the human auditory system notices something bad going on. But if you have the availability, you can have a linear setting for streamed music so that the hearing aid doesn't overly compress highly compressed music that's already coming in. Of course, we want to make sure that the analog to digital front end of a digital hearing aid does not distort with the higher levels associated with music. And if anyone's heard me talk about this issue before, I do maybe talk too much about this issue, but that's at the very front of the hearing aid. And if you don't take care that the hearing aid sound doesn't distort the music coming in, rather, uh, once music is distorted at the front end, the analog to digital stage of the hearing aid, no amount of programming or magic later on in the circuitry or the programming will improve things. So you want to have an input limiting level that is sufficiently high such that the louder components of loud music or live music, whether you're playing yourself or just listening to it, and also the peaks that are involved with music are not clipped or distorted in any way. You want to keep your digital delay as low as possible. Now, there are many circuits that we do use and programs such as noise management. This is notoriously time hungry. The way many noise management systems work is that they sample the sound and a moment later they sample it again and they correlate the two. And if there's a high correlation between the two, then it must be speech and music. If there's a low correlation between the two, then there must be noise. But it does take two samples at least over a period of time. And many hearing aids that boast digital delays in the order of 1 or 2 milliseconds, once the noise management circuit has its way, it can be 30 or 40 milliseconds in many cases. Also, a suggestion that maybe we're not there yet, but to give the musician as much control as possible with the app or various programs over the sound of their music. Many apps now have at least three band equalizers that can be used. The one thing that I won't give control to the musician over is the maximum output. I want to ensure that that does not exceed their tolerance limiting level or, God forbid, create any further additional hearing loss. So I'm in favor of giving the musician as much control as possible, with exception of the maximum output, where I want to verify that and limit that to the extent possible. And I do want to disable frequency lowering algorithms, whether it's called sound recovery or audibility extender in different terminology in the field, except in one case. And that one case is, let's look at frequency lowering. First, we have to go way, way back to 1950. Halliwell Davis did a wonderful study in the 1950s with a lot of his colleagues. And in fact, he was a subject himself. I met Halliwell Davis back when ASHA was in Toronto, I think in 80 or 81 or maybe 82, 1982. And steel yourself for when you ever meet someone famous in the field. Be prepared to have something to say. I kind of went up to him and blatantly, my first question, even before hello, was, were you a subject in the 1950 experiment? And he said, oh, geez, not another groupie. And I'm sure he's forgotten all about the restraining order he took out of me after that. But Davis did a very, no, he's not like that. Or he wasn't like that anyway. He did a very interesting study. He took 10 servicemen, or 10 or 12, I can't remember the number. He said, I want you to sacrifice one ear for your country. So he created a temporary, what he hoped was a temporary threshold shift in one ear by blasting them with a lot of loud level noise and protected the other ear. So we had a unilateral high frequency sensory neural loss, hopefully temporary. He was one of the subjects himself. That was common back then in the 1940s and 50s for experimenters to use their own self as subjects. This is true of phonetics with Ladefoged as well. He was frequently a subject in his own phonetics. But what they would do once they created this temporary hearing loss on one ear is that they were provided with two unmarked knobs. One was frequency and one was sound level or intensity. And they were asked to match the sound in the good ear with what they perceived or heard in the bad ear. And in the lower frequencies, there was a good one-to-one correspondence. As the pitch went up in the good ear, the bad ear, the pitch went up as well. And there was a good one-to-one correspondence. But when you got into the higher frequency region, around 3 or 4,000 hertz, where the hearing loss was significantly affected, as the frequency in the good ear went up, the pitch in the bad ear didn't get higher pitched. It got louder. Hence, many people use the term recruitment. More nerves were recruited, um, but the pitch was not loud, higher. In other words, the damaged ear was more and more flat relative to the good ear. And in fact, we heard the subjects heard the sound as flat relative to the good ear. And this is a great diagnostic indicator that we can use clinically. If someone comes in, you ask them the question, does music sound flat? Or they may more often than not volunteer to you, my music sounds flat compared to the way I remember it. That's an indication of a what we now call a cochlear dead region. Of course, in Hallowell Davis's time, they just called it diplocusis. The opposite study has yet to be done. What about a low frequency sensory neural hearing loss or reverse slope, Meniere's or some other function endolymphatic hydrops? People would presumably hear the sound as being sharp. It's never been published yet, but I am working with two students right now at different universities that are trying to replicate that study with a low frequency sensory neural hearing loss. Let's go to this slide first. Brian Moore from Cambridge University in the 1990s came out with a wonderful test called the 10 test, threshold, equalization, and noise test. And then he came out with a version that was HL, that was calibrated for the audiogram, so you wouldn't have to calibrate. It took about 10 minutes for 4 frequencies. And that was me. Some people claim they can do it in 8 minutes. I could never do it in less than 10. I don't do it anymore. It was great. It gave us a certain frequency region that the damage was significant enough such that we want to avoid. And he called this the cochlear dead regions. Nowadays, I just use this, my piano keyboard. It takes 12 seconds. This is something that the musician can actually do before they even come to the office. They can find a piano at home, a friend's place, a music store. I happen to have a clinic piano, but you can download any number of apps off the internet and be able to play audio files for your clients. Start from an octave or two above middle C, where the damage would typically occur, and have them play adjacent notes, white note, white note. White note, black note, white note, so on, all the way up to the right-hand side of the piano keyboard. And the task is to tell us whether two adjacent notes do not sound different in pitch. So you get to a region near the right-hand side of the piano keyboard, which is around 4,000 hertz. And if two notes don't sound significantly different in pitch, that's evidence of a cochlear dead region. That takes 10 minutes. That's something that the musician can do themselves. They may not know it's 3,000 hertz because they think in terms of A, B, and B flat and C. But if you know that the top end of the piano keyboard is around 4,100 hertz, say 4,000, an octave below is 2,000. And if, let's say, it was 4 or 5 notes, white notes from the top end of the piano keyboard, you suspect it's probably around 3,000, but they would say the G, we would say 3,000 hertz. So we know that 3,000 hertz is the beginning of a cochlear dead region that we want to avoid. This whole thing takes 10 or 12 seconds, and it's also something that the musician can do at home, bring with them that information. If you wanted to look at the research, there's two wonderful studies that talk about whether you would have these dead regions, whether, in other words, you would have a narrower frequency response, less high frequencies than someone else. You have to look at Hazir Aj and Brian Moore's study in 2007, and then a similar study by Todd Ricketts, Andrew Dittberner, and Earl Johnson at Vanderbilt in 2008. They were not looking at music, they were looking at speech. But again, this is a cochlear thing, not a nature of the input sound per se. So it doesn't matter whether it's music or speech. And they found that with a mild loss, there's probably no chance of any cochlear dead regions, and you can have a broad bandwidth. If the hearing loss was much more than a moderate level, 60 or dB, sensorineural loss, then usually you're going to run into cochlear dead regions, and you would have to restrict the higher frequency amplification or transpose lower into a healthier region. And similarly, if there's a steeply sloping audiogram, then also this would be evidence of a cochlear dead region. And again, you might want to have a narrower bandwidth. So the rule of thumb is widest possible bandwidth for speech and music programs. If it's a mild loss, not so wide, or frequency lowering if it is more greater than a mild loss. Frequency, if you want to look at the what the industry has done or the terminology that the industry has used for their frequency lowering algorithms, frequency transposition is a linear decrease. An example of that is the Widex audibility extender. Frequency translation, also known as spectral envelope warping, and that Starkey Spectral IQ has that. The first one could be thought of as a cut and paste, taking it linearly as a chunk and moving it to a lower frequency region. Frequency translation is more of a copy, reduce the level somewhat, and paste level. 1 and 2 are actually very similar in that they're both linear, and we'll come back to this shortly. A third approach, sound recovery, is a nonlinear compression. Phonak, Unitron, and a few other manufacturers use this nonlinear approach. When it comes to speech, any of these can work very usefully and be very useful. When it comes to music, either don't do it, or we'll be talking about number 1 and 2, the linear decreases, very shortly. And the reason why frequency lowering works is that what is being lowered? It's the broadband signals, the S's, the SH's, the sibilants, the affricates, the fricatives. These have broad bands of energy. S, for example, is energy beginning at around 4,000 hertz, but it would still sound like an S if that was lowered to 37 or 3,600 hertz and above. So it's moving entire bands of noise a little bit lower. If it's too low, of course, it might be confused with the SH, which has energy starting at about 2,500 hertz. And there's some data that too much can be problematic for speech, especially in the higher frequencies, but a little bit can be very, very useful. But what is not frequency lowered are the harmonics. So in speech, if you look at the vowels, the nasals, ah, they're made up of harmonics, multiples of a fundamental frequency. My fundamental frequency is 125 hertz. So I have harmonics at 125 hertz, 250 hertz, 375 hertz, 500 hertz, 625, and so on, integer multiples of my fundamental. And these are not altered at all. Music, however, is a little bit different than speech in that its music is like the lower frequency of speech. That is, it's harmonics in the lower frequencies like speech, but also harmonics in the higher pitch. So if you decrease a harmonic that, let's say, is at 3,000 hertz to 2,900 hertz, it would sound odd because pitch in music is so important and it's only defined by the relationship of the harmonics. So if you squish them down, you can run into certain problems with them. This is an experiment I did where I just took 1/2 of one semitone decrease, and only for those harmonics above 1,500 hertz. And the black is the original signal. This is a violin, I believe. And you can see in the higher frequencies on the right-hand side, it's being just decreased by 1/2 of one semitone, almost nothing. So let's listen to that an ABA file and see how it sounds. Again, A being non-transposed, B being 1/2 of one semitone, and C, A again being the original. And now we're going to look at the same thing with the full music score. But it's okay for speech because what is being transposed, it's only the sibilants or the broadbands.
Finally, I can curl up with my book and escape to the roaming wilds of Nottingham. Finally, I can curl up
Incredible.
with my book and escape to the roaming wilds of Nottingham. Finally, I can curl up with my book and escape to the roaming wilds of Nottingham.
So there's no significant decrease or negative aspect for speech. So what do you do for music? Well, we generally just gradually roll off the high end. So this is an example of a 6 decibel per octave roll off above 1,000 hertz. You still have the higher frequency elements there, but it's reduced. So yes, 3,000 hertz at 70 dB may in fact be problematic and may cause distortion in the cochlea, but 3,000 hertz at 40 or 50 dB may not cause it. So at a lower level, you can still get away with it. And again, if you listen to it, it really doesn't appreciably change. Again, the ABA system. This is okay. Um, but there is one example that is an exception. It's the island of refuge. And what if it was exactly 1 octave? So if all frequencies above 1,500 hertz were dropped exactly linearly, not logarithmically or otherwise, by exactly 1 octaves. So all the harmonics line up with pre-existing harmonics, but then you have creation of a few other harmonics that were not there in the original signal. And it could be something like a third or it could be a fifth. But a third and a fifth, maybe that's not what the composer had in mind, but it still sounds pretty good. So this is an example. Let me see now. By the way, this is a study I just did with Dave Fabry from Starkey and Francis Cook from Widex. It came out in the January issue of Hearing Review, and we talk about how you can do that as long as it's a linear system. So this is an example where the black is the original, but the orange is the 1 octave transposed. And as you can see along the left-hand side, many of the harmonics line up with pre-existing harmonics. And then you have the creation of those intervening orange harmonics that in this case would be a perfect fifth. So it's an A, but it creates an E. And an A and an E together sound pretty good. Not what the composer had in mind, but it works pretty good. And this is what it sounds like. Okay, this would be an example of a quarter wavelength instrument, such as a clarinet, a trumpet, or French horn. And again, you get other things, but because it's a third wavelength with odd number multiples, again, you'd have the A, but it'd be a C. And again, an A and a C together, not what the composer had in mind, but it still sounds pretty good with a perfect third. But not for music. If you not for speech. If you do play it for speech, it does sound all muffled.
Finally, I can curl up with my book and escape to the roaming wilds of Nottingham. Finally, I can curl up with my book and escape to the roaming wilds of Nottingham. Finally, I can curl up with my book and escape to the roaming wilds of Nottingham.
So that was a case where too much frequency transposition, linear or otherwise, for speech is just so detrimental. So that brings us to the second top, and this gets us into the future, frequency raising algorithms as opposed to frequency lowering algorithms. And and to my knowledge, there has not been a technology or circuit that is a frequency raising algorithm, but I'm going to suggest that it's possibly time for that for two populations. One with those people with reverse slope audiograms, where you have a low frequency cochlear dead region or cochlear low frequency diplocusis or distortion, and you want to shift that sound up into a healthier region of the cochlea, a mid or a higher frequency. Also, cochlear implants have a significant difficulty transducing the lower frequency sounds and the rhythm. And many people feel that if they are bimodally fit, that is, cochlear implant in one ear and a hearing aid in the other ear, it's better than with two cochlear implants because the hearing aid gives them something the cochlear implant does not give them something. So if the frequency raising algorithm is linear, and again is exactly one octave, this should be good for both speech and music. Again, you'll have lining up of certain of the harmonics, and sometimes you can have a creation of things that are not there in the original signal, such as again a perfect fifth. C becomes a G, or C has creates also a G. So this is a bass clef, and as you can see, it creates this new orange thing there. And if you look at it on the left-hand side, this is a more of a copy and paste thing, where the arrow is, it suggests that that this new thing, which is harmonically quite non-dissonant, sounds pretty good. So this is a cello, again, in an ABA format. Okay, and again, this is for orchestration, not just music. So sounds pretty good, and it takes all the sounds that would either be missed by the processing of the cochlear implant or maybe been highly distorted by a low frequency sensory neural hearing loss and shifts it up into a healthier region of the cochlea. So that's something to look forward to, I think, in our industry. The third point is I want us to all rethink 1500 hertz. For those that know me, it's my favorite frequency. I know that sounds nerdy to have it for a favorite frequency, but let's talk about 1500 hertz and what that means to people. Well, one way we can accomplish this is by using oversized receivers for hearing aids. Now, the receiver power and the size generates gain in the output in the hearing aid. And of course, we use the larger receivers to provide this gain and output for more significant hearing losses. And we did a study where we used overly oversized receivers for people with more minor, mild, and up to moderate level hearing losses. We, of course, had to compensate to reduce the gain in the output by about 6 decibels when we went from a standard to a power receiver, or a power receiver to a standard one, rather. But they thought when we did that, it sounded so much better. And the receiver side and also the port opening, the opening of the nozzle defines the resonances. This is what we all learned in school as Helmholtz resonances, named after von Helmholtz. But we do know that larger receivers having a larger volume have lower frequency resonances than smaller ones. And also, if you look at the nozzle port, we do know that the narrower, the thinner the port, the resonant frequencies are moved down a little bit. And we don't have to go through the Helmholtz equations, although they're not that difficult. We learned this in speech acoustics in school. We do know, for example, looking at this slide, this is the form and structure along of first two formants of vowels. E ranging on the far left to oo on the right, and we can go from the E to the oo, yeah, right to the very back. So that you think of this as time along the x-axis. The y-axis is frequency. So this is actually the resonant frequency locations of any number of or second resonances. In the vocal tract, of course, we call them formants. But if you look at the one on the far left, E, and the one on the far right, oo, it's the lowest frequency first formant. That's no surprise. That just means whenever you have the tongue close to the roof of the mouth, there's a very little opening, a very narrow opening there, and that little narrow opening creates a very low frequency formant. So if we can put an insert into the nozzle of a normal receiver, it would actually lower all the resonances. I'm not suggesting we do that because it would roll off the higher frequencies as well, but you could do that. Well, why am I even talking about that? Well, many of my musician patients and others as well do feel that when the frequencies are lowered such that there's one in the 1500 hertz region, it sounds warmer and more pleasant. And that's the beauty of 1500 hertz. We also get that when we cup the hands behind your ear. And when we're doing that, we're actually increasing the sound around 1500 hertz by about 10 to 12 decibels. This is from Uchansky and Sarli. They did some interesting work and with a probe tube microphone system, and they found that there was, in this case, about a 12 decibel mid-frequency enhancement when you cup your ears. Of course, the pinna itself creates a pinna effect, which continues on to the higher frequencies, but this artificial cupping just gives you back that 1500 hertz. Um, Also, cupping your hand around a microphone. We've all seen pop singers, usually women, that when they grab the microphone, they don't grab it by the handle as we're taught to do in school, but they grab around the cone of the microphone, the top of the microphone, and that also increases the output at around 1500 hertz. If you look on the right-hand side, the middle one, that cupping of the hand, there is a 1500 hertz enhancement. They may claim it sounds better, but I think it more looks better on a video that they're almost kissing the microphone. I'm sure that the sound engineer can just boost up the gain by about 5 or 6 decibels at 1500 hertz to give them the warmth that maybe they think they're getting. So there's no need to do this, but it does look good. So many people are suggesting training mics where you could prevent people's hands from cupping over the ball, the cone of the microphone. But it does give you more boost at 1500 hertz. Also, old style media, the cassettes that were used initially in the 60s, but certainly well into the 80s, the old analog cassettes, both the Stones and the Beatles, would only want to use one type of tape back then for all the music. And some of them gave you a bit of a boost around 1500 hertz. So let's look at the three that were available in the 1960s and 70s and early 80s. Ampex 456 was a very commonly used one, and it had a bump in the lower frequency range. Scotch Brand 250 had a bump in the higher frequency range, but the AGFA 467 had an increase around 1500 hertz. And this was the only one that the Beatles and the Stones would allow their music to be played on or mass produced and distributed on in the cassette era. And this came out of a biography of Keith Richards by Bocris. And there are several biographies of him. And that's where I got that information from. And he was quite adamant about that. I'm not sure that Keith Richards knew it was 1500 hertz, but he probably knew it just sounded better. Didn't know why, perhaps. But we know, and I think it's due to 1500 hertz. So if you have patients and they're happy with the hearing aids for both speech and music, as an experiment, boost up the gain and the output around 1500 hertz, not a lot, maybe 4 or 5 decibels, and see what they say. Some may not notice much of a difference, some may not like it. I think most of them will like it, especially for the music program. 4, using one's own hearing aids as in the ear monitors. Now, there are two things that in the ear hearing aids cannot do yet. in the ear monitors cannot do yet. One is that they cannot provide a level dependent output like hearing aids can, where we have, let's say, a lot of gain being provided for soft level inputs, less gain being provided by middle level inputs, and almost no gain or very little gain provided for very loud level or high level inputs. So that level dependent nature of hearing aids has made it so useful to try to address some of the issues with the damaged cochlea. The in-ear monitors currently do not do this. They are linear or straight amplifiers. They can be connected to other things on the rack, which could change the frequency response, equalizers, for example, but they are not level dependent. And the other thing brings us to that other point that hearing aids, our own hearing aids, can provide a frequency response that has been optimized for someone's hearing loss with all the little nooks and crannies. And we can verify this with real ear measurement in the person's ear. With an in the ear monitor, if you ever dropped a probe into the ear, they're anything but flat. They can be made flat, and you can work with them to make them flat, but that's quite rare for that to happen off the shelf. It's like a first fit. You have to do a little bit of playing with it, just kind of get it just right. So that's the second thing that in-ear monitors cannot do. So can we use our own hearing aids in place of in-ear monitors for hard of hearing musicians? That's this topic here. There's an article at the bottom here. Chasin and Morris, Steve Morris, he and I wrote an article that came out in the March issue, 2024 of Hearing Review, which was a cookbook on how do you do it. The original article that got me thinking about that was by Le Sample in 2020. At that time, he worked for Bernafon, and now I believe he works for Sonovar Corporation. And they suggested, well, why can't you use a emitter, a Bluetooth accessory like a TV listening device, hook it up to your output of your audio rack in a live performance, and as long as the musician is within 30 feet, about 10 meters, which is the limit of Bluetooth today, they should be able to hear effectively their own music and play it. And they can play it through their own amplification with their own level dependent input and their own frequency response. When I did that with some patients, it didn't sound very good. Some cases, it sounded a little bit quiet. Other cases, it sounded distorted. And so I started to scratch my head as to why. And then I talked to some of the audio people, and they said, well, why don't we just put a preamp between the output stage and the Bluetooth accessory? A preamp is just a volume control. For some people, it did improve things. It made it sufficiently loud, and they said, oh, that sounds pretty good. Others were finding that it was sounding a little bit distorted. So that wasn't the total solution. And it turns out that a solution was that we want to ensure that balanced to balance and unbalanced to unbalanced. Well, we don't normally deal with issues like balanced and unbalanced in audiology. But if you've ever taken a sound recording class, maybe as part of your acoustics phonetics course in school, certain microphones, like the old dynamic microphones that didn't require a battery, I could have a cable that would maybe be 2 meters long, or maybe 4 meters, or 10 feet, or 20 feet, and that was pretty fine. If it got beyond about 15 to 20 feet of cabling, the sound from the microphone degraded significantly, and that was an unbalanced microphone. In contrast, the more modern type, the capacitor, or what used to be called the condenser microphone, has a power source in it, is a balanced system. We could have a cable that is 1 foot long, 500 feet long, or 5,000 feet long. It wouldn't really matter. The sound would not degrade, and that was a balanced system. So that's how we learned about balanced and unbalanced. And we could have a whole session on the difference between balanced and unbalanced. But trust me that some things that come out of an audio rack are balanced, some things are not balanced. And if we just ascribe to the the belief that we want to match them, make sure that balance goes to balance and unbalance goes to balance, we can actually solve this problem. And that's what I deal with in this Chasin and Morris article from March of Hearing in Hearing Review. This is an example where the sound coming out of the rack, I would put it into the thing on the top left. That's, yes, it's a preamp, but a preamp is about $80 or $90. This device I pick up for about, it's called a digital injector or dynamic injector sometimes, but it's a preamp and a balance unbalanced converter. It automatically takes care of it. And this was also $80 or $90. So I have one of these for $80 or $90. I have to unfortunately make sure that there's an adapter coming out of the rack, um, has female to female XLR adapters that will go into this preamp system. On one side, it will have the input. On the other side, it would go to my accessory that you see there. And through Bluetooth, it listens or transmits to the performer. By the way, you would have to have what's called an XLR adapter. I for lack of any other reason to talk about XLR, it's one of my favorite topics. Why is it? Why are those cables called XLRs? Those are the cables that you see in the top left that have three little dots in them, as opposed to these little RCA jacks. Canon was the first manufacturer to make them, and on their Canon X series, hence the X, they came out with a three-pronged output stage, which was excellent for a balanced system, like a like a capacitor or a condenser microphone. They found though that as they pulled the cord, it came off. It came detached often, so they needed a latch, a little clip on the side of it, hence the L for a latch. And then sometimes when they plugged in those little three pins, they would bend the pins over. So you wanted to encase them, or at least the holes, in a hard rubber so that they would go into a certain slot. And we've seen them before. And that's the R for rubber. So XLR just means Canon X series latch rubber adapter, but we all know about XLR cables. So from the rack goes into the XLR input of my little adapter with a little volume control to act like a preamp. And then the other end goes to any TV listening system. And through the TV listening system, it directs it to the individual listener. And they can route them directly to their hearing aid. So with this system, it's one accessory, one adapter, which is maybe less than $100. You can actually use your own hearing aids up on stage, and we've done this successfully on a number of occasions now. This is the most famous violin in the world. This is known as the Red Violin. There was a movie in the 1990s with Samuel Jackson about it. The idea behind this Felix Mendelssohn Red Violin is that Stradivarius, when he was making the violin, unfortunately, his wife passed away. He was so distraught. The story goes that he used some of his wife's blood in the varnish of the violin. That's been disproven. They've done genetic testing, and there's no evidence of any blood in it. But that was the story, and you still hear that story today. This is the current owner of the Red Violin, Elizabeth Pitcairn. She happened to be giving a summer camp up in the Adirondacks, which is in upper New York State. And my wife has a cottage there. And so my wife said, "Do you want to go and see the Red Violin?" I thought she meant maybe a local theater group was doing a reenactment of the movie with Samuel Jackson about the Red Violin. But sure enough, when I got there, it was the Red Violin. And at the end of the performance, I was able to bully my way onto stage. They had this 12-year-old kid acting as security, but I could take him down, no problems. I'm a black belt in karate. I'm actually only certified to take down 5-year-olds because the 8-year-olds, they typically come after you. But I was able to get very close to her. I had to keep my hands in my pocket and have my picture taken. I was not allowed to touch it. And I'm also sure that Elizabeth has forgotten all about that restraining order she took out on me as well, unfortunately. This is some contact information for me. Marshall.chasin@rogers.com will get directly to me, as will info at musicians musiciansclinics.com. Musiciansclinics.com is kind of neat. It's my website, but it has a lot of good publications. So if you click on it, scroll over to the publications, it will have sections on hearing loss prevention for musicians, hearing aids and music for musicians, hearing aids and music, another section on acoustics, and the final section on it's a humorous articles I've written over the years that talk about technical principles. But for example, what if Humphrey Bogart in The Maltese Falcon, which is a 1940s film noir, was actually an audiologist, and somebody had come in complaining about a missing C sharp, and in fact, it's called the case of the missing C sharp. Anyway, if you scroll over a little bit more to the demos section and then scroll down, all the audio files that you heard today can be found in musiciansclinics.com in the demos section. The frequency raising audio files are not yet in there, but they should be in there shortly. Thank you.